There are skulls in the wall. Why are there skulls in the walls? No! Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Forge. This is Sewerscapes Part 2, Detail and Paint. So let's get to the table and let's get this done. Okay, so if you want to take a piece of coving with a couple of bits on the back and turn it from this into something a bit more like this, you're going to need to start off with a few tools. First off, you're going to need a decent ruler, and for me I use 2 rulers for this project. You're going to need a pencil, decent sharp nib on it. You're going to need some kind of scalpel, X-Acto, some kind of knife, and of course you're going to need some tin foil, so just roughly ball that up, and that's about all you need. So the first step in this process is to get yourself a nice ridge along the bottom, which is going to be for the most part the plane surface that your characters are going to be sitting on. Now for me, I decided that a 1 inch would possibly be a little bit restricting, and I didn't really like the aesthetic, so I decided to go a little bit wider. So what I did was I took this size ruler, and if you line it up to the front, it gives a nice wide width, something that I thought was aesthetically pleasing. And what you need to do is just take your pencil, run a line all the way down it, okay, and that's going to give you your playing surface. Now obviously you're going to want to make sure that those lines are nice and visible, worked in a little bit. So once you've done your initial pass and you're happy with it, press down a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's what you're left with. Now, one thing that I've come to learn from doing this project is I needed a second ruler. The only reason for that is because this one is cheap, it's really flexible. I mean, this thing is like, I don't know what it's made of. It's supposed to be some kind of steel, but it is incredibly thin, but it is very flexible. So what I tend to do is I tend to go along and mark out my inch markings. Now these markings, when connected, will give us our implied grid for a distance measure, so you don't have to get a stick into a tiny dungeon-esque environment. So everybody loves playing gridless until you're inside a tiny building and you can't get a stick or a measure of some kind in there, and you have to guesstimate. So go along, mark out 1 inch increments along the top, line it up, mark out your 1 inch increments along the bottom. You don't have to be super precise, but if you want it to be at all symmetrical, you want it to have a certain look about it, I would suggest you make sure that you're a little bit accurate with it, because otherwise everything will just be wonky and just generally not give you a nice look. So the reason that this flexible ruler is so good for this purpose is because you need to get into this curve. Okay, I tried it with this ruler and it was, although a very good ruler with a nice soft backing for grip and everything else, this is just not flexible enough to get into that tight nook. And I was finding that it's giving me all kinds of wonky measures of a straight line, i.e. not a bloody straight line. You see this just bends straight in there, boom, done. Okay, so what you want to do is just go along, connect your dots, better than that one. Now, if you do make a mistake like that, don't worry, it's not the end of the world, because what you can do is just redo your line, and you'll add that bit in. There's a little bit of texture, so just pack it down like a chipped flagstone. Just remember to accentuate anything like that in a semi-decorative way so that it realistically represents a crack in a flagstone or some kind of damage. Remember, these are sewers, after all. They're a utility area, they're not going to look perfect, so don't worry about little mistakes like that, because they will happen, especially when you've got as many of these things to make as I have. You can't get too precious about the minutiae. Okay, so once you've done all of your marks, what you need to do is go down the front and just carry those down to what will be where the water's edge, I say water, I mean river of turds, is going to eventually go. So remember that bit of damage from the top. What I'm going to do is just carry that on down, the sensible chunk off the front, and that's it. That one, a little bit skewed, so what I'm going to do is just make it into a little bit of damage. Now remember, with this, you're trying to get a decent dip in the styrofoam, so don't be frustrated if you have to make more than one pass to get a deep enough mark, because one way or another, if you don't go deep enough, the detail will not show up, you will have nothing to catch when you dry brush, and you'll just be frustrated with a bland looking tile. So dig deep. So for the most part, that is the start of what is going to be a playable area. So just for example, I will stick a mini on there. Nice 1-inch grid, playable surface, you can get in, everything works. So the next big step is going to be doing some kind of stone texture along the back wall. Now honestly, the method that I've chosen for mine is a purely aesthetic one, and when you look, the stones are quite small, okay? They are fiddly to do, but they have a lot of detail. I've picked out a few larger stones, bricks, bits and pieces. These are designed to give you an idea of almost a rushed construction. Like, these have scavenged. The only bits that are made deliberately are the flagstones for the actual floor. The rest of it is just found materials, like stones from a farm or something. My suggestion would be, if you want to cut down the time that it takes to produce these tiles, choose a brick pattern or some kind of larger stones. Don't worry necessarily about keeping it to scale, because there is no scale. This is a fantasy genre. You can make these stones any size you like. I'd say if you go with something nice and simple, like a traditional stone built pattern, you are going to have a much easier time producing something that isn't going to make you age drastically by the time it's finished. So to show you what the technique is, I'm going to choose a slightly smaller piece, because I am not going to bore you to tears doing this whole thing. I mean, I want to get this done before either of us needs to be looking at retirement. So what I tend to do is I will start out by picking out a couple of larger rocks, something that's going to catch the eye, give a little bit of interest to even the smallest of pieces. So for instance, just freehand in some kind of larger stone or rock, okay? It doesn't have to be perfectly square unless you want it to be, but a good idea is get your main shape and run your pencil back around it to emphasize those lines. Now have a look at any old stone building. You're going to notice that they're stone masons who milled these rocks back in the old days would have actually done a series of marks on the front This is kind of like their signature, interestingly enough. And if you're going to do a lot of these rocks, if you want them to be uniform, feel free to give it a uniform pattern all over. If it's a very deliberate looking build for this, it's supposed to be recovered or stolen materials, so I tend to put a few different styles and patterns on. Just helps make it a little bit more visually interesting. So what I tend to do is, once I've found, probably I'll put another big stone down here, just mark that off there. This one I'm just going to do a very similar marking, slightly different. Okay, now what I tend to do is I tend to start off, let me just refocus, I tend to start off by making sensible stones near and around the big ones, give you some kind of polarizing focal point to get you started. Okay, means that you don't end up with piddly little rocks right next to what would be something quite large. Finish this one off. Okay, so got a few decent stones gathered around the outside. What I tend to do then is go along the bottoms, making slightly different shaped rocks. Okay, and then filling in the gaps. So if you've ever looked at a brick wall, it often has a certain pattern to it, so that there is a support underneath most of the bricks. So 1, 2, 3. So you're going to end up with a gap and then a solid brick above. This is something that they've been doing for thousands of years because it's one way of tying the rocks together, making sure that you don't end up with a weak point that goes right the way up the wall, because that would just be crap. Now, I don't tend to be particularly meticulous about this. One thing I will say is, once you've got a few bricks down, it's usually a good idea to run around them all a little bit, because what you find is you get some weird sort of sharp edges that, unless these blocks are cut to size deliberately, you are not going to get perfectly angled bricks. So feel free to round these off, kind of like cobblestones. One thing I like to do when I get to the top is I like to follow these stones round so they logically would look like actual boulders. You know, there's going to be some carry through. Like, they don't have to go all the way to the back, but you know, these need to, in my mind, realistically represent some kind of stacked boulder. So if you've got something like this one that comes across quite large, feel free to carry it over the smaller one here. I just find that makes life a little bit nicer when you can look at it and go, okay, that actually looks like it has some three-dimensional space behind it. It's not just some piece of crap some madman stuck together in his bedroom. Okay, so have a quick look over, see any areas that aren't quite as deep as you'd like, any areas that are way too manufactured. Nibble off those corners with your pencil. You don't have to go over all of it, because of course the next step will be some kind of texturing, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Now, for the sake of interest, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a crack to this flagstone. So essentially just imagine a point of impact. Okay, but this crack, I kind of try and let the pencil take an almost organic line to the nearest places. Okay, now that already to me looks quite good, but what I tend to do is think, would I be able to carry this down the front? Is there any way I can make it more visually interesting? There's a bit of a bold spot here, so what I'm going to do is sort of lead that up to the top. Okay, don't be afraid to run it a few times, because you'll notice that you tend to get a lot of sub fractures and stuff on stonework where it follows the natural contours where the minerals have been laid down. Now, not too bad. Now, one thing that's always quite nice to do is run it back along the front, so you get the sort of idea that it's not just a one-dimensional, two-dimensional crack. This thing is an actual slab that has been cracked. Now, you can get away with sinking a little bit of this if you want, or chipping the piece away at the front, just to make it look like it's taken some real damage. For this one, I'm not going to bother, I'm just going to leave it as is, because I kind of think that that looks pretty good as it is. The next step is going to be tinfoil ball. Okay, so take your tinfoil ball, don't scrunch it up too tight because you want to leave lots of nice angles on that to give you some texture. Now, when you're going along the top bit, just roll it, okay? You don't have to push too hard because this thing is jagged, alright? You want it to look like stone, but you don't want it to look like it's been completely bombarded. You're not doing a war zone set. You're literally just giving it the impression that there is some stone texture. So these aren't flat cobbles, these imply some form of detail. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to see that or not, but there is plenty of texture on there now. I mean, I tend to work for subtlety, but you can make it as obvious as you like. Now, when it comes to the slabs at the bottom, I've still not done those, and I'll tell you for why. What I tend to do is very lightly just roll across the surface, okay? Because these are supposed to be milled pieces of stone. These aren't just dug up out of some field or something. I'm literally applying zero pressure to that, just enough to hold the tinfoil onto the surface, and it will cause damage to it. If anyone's ever installed polystyrene coving into their house, you'll know how delicate you have to be to make sure you don't knacker it before it actually goes up. What you end up with is a very subtle indentation, which when painted will give you the impression of a flagstone that's made of stone rather than just a piece of rock that's been smashed to crap. For this part of the project, you're going to need to get yourself a soft but firm brush, some black acrylic paint, a small tub and some water. Mix a little water into the black acrylic paint just to help flow it. At this part of the project, you could decide to use the Black Magic base coat as seen on Black Magic Craft. I decided not to, as these pieces are quite durable on their own. Apply plenty of black acrylic paint to the piece, making sure to get it into all the nooks and crannies. Here I use a circular scrubbing motion to make sure it gets in between all of the cobblestones, leaving no white gaps or air bubbles. When painting over the flagstones, make sure to go both against and with the direction of the lines. This ensures that you get a good top coat. You also get right in between all of the lines that have been scribed into it. When base coating these pieces, make sure you paint the back side as well as the stands and the front. This will ensure that you don't break the illusion of a sewer piece on the table by having awful white and blue pieces. Once the back side is done, touch up any pieces that have been rubbed away by your fingers or by the table. Remove any excess paint from the brush and go over the whole piece in smooth, long strokes. This will help to define detail by removing excess paint whilst leaving an adequate base coat. Okay, for this part of the project, you're going to need some black acrylic paint, some white acrylic paint, a smattering of other colours. Primarily, you're just going to be wanting to dry brush this whole thing, first up with a darker coat of grey, then a lighter coat. Eventually, a very light dry brush of white just over the very edges. Now, when prepping to do a dry brush of this kind, best bet is to have some of this stuff. It's just some kitchen roll to you and me. If you can see on here, There's quite a few bits and pieces of texture to pick up, quite a few highlights, some lowlights, a couple of signature blocks which are a little different to the rest. So what we'll do is we'll pick those out later, the nice coat, slightly different colour. First off, what I'm going to do is mix some white and black together to get the grey I like. Now, this is only the first coat. This one wants to be fairly dark, but it still wants to be obvious once it's actually dried that it is grey rather than just another kind of black, which would be pointless. And I work for subtlety, but you've really got to make the difference. Otherwise, what's the point? Now remember, with acrylics, you'll end up with a product that actually dries darker than the colour that you send out with. So, put that to one side. Take off as much of the water as I can off this brush. Work that paint into a paper towel. And hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm doing here. Knocking a very light dry brushing a dark grey over the top. So that coat wasn't exactly as light as I wanted it to be. So what I'm going to do is add some more white to the mix and see how we get on. Now, I reckon this coat might be a little bit more obvious. So I want to make sure that my brush is good dry, so I don't end up just overpowering the whole thing. Now for this piece I'm actually using quite a large brush. The reason for that is it covers easier. If you're not confident with dry brushing, I would say start with a smaller piece, test piece, and start with a smaller brush, just so that if you cock it up it's not a nightmare to solve. Now when you're dry brushing, try and keep it light. Starting to catch those pieces. Hope that you can see it. This coat usually doesn't come up too well on the camera because it is subtle, but it's amazing how much depth pops out just this initial dry brushing. Now hoping that you can see this along here. Now when dry brushing the flagstones, make sure to go the opposing way to any forward facing edges, any lateral edges, because what you'll find is it will naturally pick up the edges of those. For everything else, make sure you get some variety. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that, but that's a good shot. That's already started to pick up the detail and leave the recesses on the flagstones exposed, picking out that detail quite nicely. This is the piece I'm currently doing, and this is the piece I've done before. It's only subtle, but in person the difference between those is quite good. So the new one needs a very light dry brushing of a very pale grey. Onto my brush, take it onto a different surface. I'm just using my paint map, which is 2 sheets of A5 paper, just taped together, protects my desk somewhat. I'm just blending this out until I end up with a grey that I'm actually happy to use. I think that will just about do. Now the reason you always want to mix out your paint onto an absorbent surface like paper or paper towel, or even a real towel if you want one to throw away, is that it takes the excess moisture out of the paint, but allows you to retain pigment that you can dust essentially onto the surface. Now with terrain, dry brushing isn't as subtle an art form as it is with miniatures, so you know, don't slave over it, but remember, I aim for subtlety. You can be as obvious as you like. If you want it to really look the part, you have to put some effort in. Just remember, you're trying to catch highlight detail, you're not trying to repaint the thing a different colour. So don't worry if there's dark spots and light spots, as long as you're picking up detail, it should be alright. Remember, in most subterranean situations, the light source is going to be quite diffuse, so don't necessarily worry about light coming straight down like you normally would if you're practicing top-down lighting for miniatures or what have you. Just make sure that you're catching all the edges to show where the light is striking. Okay, so you're starting to get quite a nice highlight, picking up all that detail. And the flagstones just look excellent. Dark recesses look dark, the tops look like they've got some texture. So looking pretty good so far. What we're going to do next is really light, almost white dry brush, but you really want to make sure that this is delicate. Remember, once this dries, it's going to dry darker. You've got to try and pick this out, imagine what it's going to look when it dries, which can be a bit of a challenge, but once you get the hang of it, you'll know what you're doing. I would suggest, don't just paint one of these at a time like I'm doing for this. I would suggest you batch paint this. Mix up your colours to start off, and when you're happy with the colour blends, set down and do all of your pieces at once. That way they'll tie together nicely. If you do them one at a time like this, generally you will find that there is going to be a trade-off with colour. So this is real pale dry brush. Actually finding there's a lot of dark colour still coming out of my brush. Trying to get as much of the dark out as I can, so I can apply some light. Okay, this has got to be very delicate over the top, just to catch the extreme highlights. You should start to see all those stones start to really pop. It catches all those little edges, make the darks look darker without over lightening the piece. What I always like to do is catch these edges just so they're a little bit more visible. Pay a little bit more attention to those. And you see what's happened there? Somehow I've got a big splodge of white paint on it. Don't panic. What you can do is take a look at your kitchen roll. A little bit of water, spittle, whatever you got to hand. Mop it up. Just take the excess off. Remember, your base coat will be fully dried, so I'm not going to take that off. Before it all fully dries, take up as much excess as you can. Blend that down. Don't worry about smudging it off with your fingers. Eventually, end up with something that looks like that. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of burnt sienna to my light grey with a small brush. Okay. What that'll do give us a nice blended colour to pick out just a few of the slightly larger stones. And a little bit more flavour. Now I know what you're thinking, that looks lighter than the previous piece you showed us. Well, this is one reason it's not a problem to go a little bit lighter, because what you're going to want to do is we're going to want to wash this. Okay, so if you've never done ceramic before, a wash is essentially just paint that has been added with a little bit of flow aid, something like a little bit of dish soap, just a tiny amount, breaks the surface tension, allows pigment, paint and the water to mix in and wash in between the detail, leaving it highlighted but with added depth. Now for a project like this, you'll probably want to mix up a fair amount of wash in one go so that the whole project looks tied together when you wash it. Even if you do the bits and pieces separately, soak it in a wash, let it dry, it will tie the pieces together, making them all look a little bit more uniform. Okay, so the wash that I've used is a grey mixed in with some brown and a little bit of green because it's a sewer. Now a lot of the brown is soaked to the bottom, which isn't a problem, just give it a slight shake. Now one thing that you'll want to do is prepare yourself a waterproof container in which to do your washes. Now the piece that we've been doing should be dry by now. This should allow us to just do a nice wash without taking any of the detail off, but you do want to save all the excess wash. You don't want it pouring all over your workplace. So take it, place it in there. It doesn't quite fit, but it takes wide enough that you can pour it on. You usually apply it with a brush. You can just pour it on, but you tend to overwash, and then you're going to have to pour it all back into your jar. So what I'm going to do is take some of my wash, lay it on along the top, let it just wash down the piece. You don't want to put too much detergent in because you will get a lot of bubbles. You just want a little blob in the whole wash just to act as a flow aid, let it get into all those nooks and crannies. You'll be surprised how it can make it pop. If your wash is a little weak and it doesn't quite give you the pop that you want the first time, you can always reapply. Just make sure the piece is absolutely dry before you start. Make sure that all subsequent washes are dry before you apply a new one. So what I'll do is pick that up, drain off any excess, just so you don't end up with it pooling. Then with a paintbrush that is relatively dry, not completely dry, it can be the one you've just used, just take a bit of the excess moisture out, just go along, pull it out anywhere that you think it shouldn't be, just by dabbing, and just pull the excess straight off. Then you have one piece that's been washed. As you can see, it's still wet, but that will dry. I'll come back when it's dried. Okay, so the next step, once you've got your wash nice and dry, is to take some of this stuff. It is a cellulose sponge. Just chop yourself off a little corner. Maybe put a little bit of tape around it to make it easier to hold. But remember, before you start work with these cellulose sponges, unless you're buying them at an art store, you will need to wash the crap out. They put a load of cellulose water into it, keeps it nice and spongy and soft in the packaging, but if you try and use it without washing it off, essentially it's going to turn what we're going to do next into a big pile of smeg. So now you've got your perfectly clean washed piece of cellulose sponge, pinch it together, wrap a little bit of regular masking tape around it. This will just give you something to hold on to while we do the next step. So what you're going to need to do is grab yourself some clear gloss varnish. This is an acrylic one that I just picked up from a hobby store. This one is by Americana, so you people in the States should be able to get this quite easily. It's called Duraclear Gloss Varnish. Okay, so polyurethane based varnish. Applies really easy. What we're going to do is we're going to use this to give our piece a wet look. So what you need to do is just put a little bit onto any kind of surface that's not going to soak it all up immediately. Dab your sponge into it, make sure it's got it all over, and then just start dabbing it onto your piece. Now this is just to give it a look of clammy, wet walls and moisture that's just settled on the surfaces. This isn't to simulate running water, this isn't to simulate anything other than just moisture that's hugging to the surfaces. Condensation. Now you can overdo this a little bit, so keep an eye on where you're doing it and where you're missing bits, because you don't want any obviously dry bits or it breaks the illusion. You don't want any patches that look like they are ridiculously wet, because it will also imply that there's something else going on where there isn't. Now it's important that you buy the gloss, because if you buy the matte or the satin it won't give you the right effect. So look at the labels before you pick them up, because the pots look almost identical. Hopefully you can see that on the camera. There is a nice sheen to it, but not too much.